Art and emotion. It is frequently said that what matters most in art is emotion, both the feeling of the artist and the emotional impact of a work on its audience. If pleasure is a commonplace explanation of the value of art, expression of emotion is the commonplace view of its nature. This is a view to which we can usually give the label expressivism. This distinguishes it from a closely similar term, expressionism, a name widely used for a school of painting based on the principle that painters ought to express emotion in their pictures. The two terms and the ideas they invoke are obviously connected, but expressivism is a theory that applies to art in general and not merely to the visual arts. It is a view closely allied with 19th century Romanticism, the belief that true art is inspired by feeling, and the extensive influence of Romanticism well into the 20th century explains, at least in part, the widespread acceptance of aesthetic expressivism. In this chapter, the connection that expressivism makes between art and emotion will be explored. First, in what might be called an everyday version, and then in the more sophisticated version that is to be found in R.G. Collingwood's Principles of Art. In both cases, the crucial question will be taken to be, can the appeal to emotion explain what is valuable and important about art? Tolstoy and everyday expressivism. Not infrequently, great artists theorize about their work. This is unsurprising, but what is more surprising is that even the greatest of creative artists can take a very simple-minded view of art. One of the best-known instances of this is Leo Tolstoy, the Russian literary giant. As well as his many novels, Tolstoy wrote a short book called What is Art? And in it, the everyday conception of expressivism is set out with striking naivete. Art is a human activity consisting in this, that one man consciously, by means of a certain external signs, hands on to others feelings he has lived through, and that others are infected by these feelings and also experience them. In these few words, Tolstoy captures a picture of artistic activity that is very widely shared. Artists are people inspired by an experience of deep emotion, and they use their skill with words or paint or music or marble or movement to embody that emotion in a work of art. The mark of its successful embodiment is that it stimulates the same emotion in its audience. It is in this way that artists may be said to communicate emotional experience. This picture of the relation between artist and audience is often just taken for granted. Even more famously than Tolstoy, the poet Wordsworth, in preface to his lyrical ballads, held that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and it is not usual to hear this quoted as a statement of the obvious. Yet, we do not have to think very long about this view before serious difficulties arise. Many of these were lucidly cataloged by the American philosopher John Hospers in an essay entitled The Concept of Artistic Expression, and again at greater length in Alan Tormey's The Concept of Expression. They can be listed as follows. First, in attributing the origins of artistic production to emotional experience, we appear to be determining a priori by definition what can only be determined a posteriori by experience and investigation, namely the causal conditions under which works of art come to be. That is to say, the expression theory seems to assert in advance of considering any facts that emotional experience caused Shakespeare, Haydn, Leonardo, Christopher Wren, and countless other artists to create in the way they did. Of course, in response to this objection of assertion in advance of the facts, the doctrine espoused by Tolstoy and Wordsworth could be construed as a purely factual one. The origin of artworks has always been found to be emotion, but on this interpretation it appears to be empirically false. Many celebrated artists have expressly denied that emotion lay at the heart of their work. Second, by focusing upon the origins of a work as the criterion by which it is to be normatively classified as art, the expressivist theory seems to involve a version of what is called the genetic fallacy. This is the fallacy of assessing the merits, more usually the demerits, of something by referring to its cause. Hospers puts the point in this way. Even if all artists did in fact go through the process described by the expression theory, and even if nobody but artists did this, would it be true to say that the work of art was a good one because the artist in creating it went through this or that series of experiences implying his medium? Once the issue is put this baldly, I cannot believe that anyone could easily reply in the affirmative. It seems much too plain that the merits of a work of art must be judged by what we find in the work of art, quite regardless of the conditions under which the work of art came into being. Third, in looking for an originating emotion, we appear to be ignoring the difference between simple and complex works of art. There are indeed cases where the attribution of an overriding emotion to a work of art is quite plausible. For example, Gustav Mahler's Songs of a Wayfarer, for which Mahler wrote both words and music, is easily thought of as the outpouring of emotion, and it is not difficult to identify a single emotion that each song expresses. But this sort of attribution is much less plausible when it comes to complex cases. In a complex work with a great array of characters in a variety of relationships, the range of emotions and attitudes represented is so wide that it is impossible to say that any one is the emotion that the work expresses. What emotion lies at the heart of, or is expressed by, novels such as George Eliot's Middlemarch or Thackeray's Vanity Fair? This question is not easy to answer, but this does not mean that it is unanswerable. It might be claimed with some plausibility to change the example that Joseph Conrad's Nostromo is an expression of his deep pessimism, since it is a novel with a complex plot and a wide range of disparate characters. If this is plausible, it must be possible to regard a complex work of art as the expression of a single emotion. However, the change of example is significant. The fact that the question is reasonably easy to answer in the case of Nostromo does not make it any easier to answer with respect to Middlemarch. Moreover, as Nostromo is probably exceptional, it is doubtful if we can give any easy answer for nearly every major work of art. Consider Shakespeare's tragedies. It might be thought that these are works primarily expressing one emotion. Jealousy in the case of Othello, for example. But if Othello, the character, symbolizes jealousy, Iago equally symbolizes malice, which is the emotion of the play. In any case, the point of calling them tragedies is to focus attention not on their emotional content, but on the structure of their events. There is usually a high degree of emotion represented in a tragedy. But the tragic element, properly called so, is to be found in the interplay of character and event. In Sophocles' classical tragedy, Oedipus the king, it is forces beyond his control that makes Oedipus, despite his best efforts, bring plague on the city of Thebes. When it turns out that it is he who has killed his father, the horror he feels, so powerfully expressed by Sophocles, is the outcome of the tragedy, not its source or its meaning. So too with other art forms, the impact of Romanticism, especially in composition, can distort our perception of music and lead us to suppose that the expression of emotion is the key to music. But romantic music is not the paradigm of all music. In a toccata in Fugue by J.S. Bach, for example, it is structure that is important, and the complexity has more to do with mathematics than emotion. On the surface, at any rate, this is true of nearly all Baroque music. Yet, it would be absurd to dismiss it as valueless or of less artistic merit, just because it is not romantic. Fourth, doubts can be raised about the emotional content, not merely of specific works of art, but of forms of art. It is easy to find plausible examples of emotional expression in poetry, opera, and theater. But is it plausible to suggest that works of architecture express emotion? It seems obvious that Edward Munch's famous painting, The Scream, has depression as its subject matter. But this gives us no reason whatever to extend expressivism to the abstract painting of Piet Mondrian, though there is a school known as abstract expressionism. And despite the influence of Romanticism, there are arguments against the idea that music without words expresses emotion, a topic to be taken up again in Chapter 5. Hosper's doubts about expressivism have gained such currency that they are sometimes regarded as little more than preliminaries to the real issues. But even if they could be laid aside, there are further difficulties. How is emotion supposed to be embodied in a work of art exactly? It is clearly a requirement of the expressivist theory that it must be embodied in some way or other. This is because, for any given work, it could be true both that its creation arose from an emotional experience and that it drew an emotional response from the audience, while at the same time being false that emotion was the content of the work. For instance, imagine that a singer past his prime and somewhat despondent because he feels his powers failing, tries again to sing with the sort of vigorous jollity, for which his performances were previously admired. He fails, however, and his failure causes his admirers to be equally despondent, saddened to hear how feeble his talents have become. But the song he has chosen to sing is not a sad one. So, it must be the case, if expressivism is to be true, that emotion is to be found not merely in the artist and in the audience, but also in the work itself. Yet, if we say in this case that though the singer and the audience were feeling sad, but the song was feeling happy, this seems unintelligible. A song can't feel anything. In what sense, then, is happiness present when the singer and the audience are sad? In reply, the proponent of expressivism might draw a distinction between being an expression of happiness and being expressive of happiness. The song does not express anyone's happiness. How could it? Since all the people are sad. But it is expressive of happiness in general. This is an important distinction that we will examine more closely in a subsequent section. For the moment, however, we can note that drawing it constitutes a major modification to the everyday version of expressivism, because it implies that artworks can be described in emotional language without being directly connected to anyone's emotion. This is a major modification to Tolstoy's account of art and emotion. We have found an important gap in expressivism conception of the relation between artist and artwork. But there are also problems in the role that the Tolstoyan story assigns to the audience. Is it true that we are guilty of a failure of appreciation if at the end of Mahler's songs we are not filled with Weltschmerz, world weariness? Must we grieve to the degree that Leonce does in A Winter's Tale if we are to understand the remorse that follows his jealousy? Must we, in fact, feel jealous ourselves during the first part of the play? The answer to these questions is obvious: no. If it does not seem obvious, this is because we are misled into generalizing from two cases: sadness and fear. It is often true that sad and solemn poetry tends to induce sadness, though not always. It is certainly the case that horror and fear can be induced in an audience by films and plays. The shower scene in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is one of the most famous examples. John Ford's play, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, when Giovanni appears holding a human heart and covered in blood, is another. Once we generalize from sadness and fear, however, to all the other emotions, jealousy, despair, romantic love, hatred, patriotism, contempt, spite, and so on. Expressivism's account of an audience's involvement becomes completely implausible. Perhaps it is true that anyone completely untouched by a nostalgic work cannot really be said to have appreciated it. But we can only be said to understand and appreciate a portrayal of racist loathing if we have felt slightly racist ourselves. Even in the relatively simple case of gaiety, expressivism seems to fail because it is jokes that induce laughter in audiences and readers, rather than actors on stage being amused by them, or episodes in novels that describe people laughing. What this example makes plain is that the successful portrayal of an emotion in a work of art does not depend on generating the same emotion in the audience. It might be replied that art has to have impact, and an artwork that aims at a portrayal of any of these emotions, even those of a violent or evil nature, has to count as a failure if it leaves an audience as uncomprehending as before. In fact, this reply signals another important move away from the naive expressivism. Tolstoy describes the naive expressivism Tolstoy describes. It invokes the idea that a work of art should alter our understanding of emotion, but not that it does so by making us feel it. Understanding often generates sympathy, and so it can be true that those who come to a better understanding of an emotion come to feel differently about it. This change in feeling, though, is brought about through the intermediary of the understanding. It is not induced directly. So far, Aristotle and catharsis. So far we have seen that the everyday version of expressivism is too simplistic as a description of the relation between art and emotion. It is also inadequate as an explanation of the value of art, even if art making was an outpouring of emotion and art appreciation, a reciprocal experience of the emotion outpoured. There is this further question: what is so good about the outpouring of emotion? One suggestion appeals to the idea of catharsis, or purging. This is the theory that by arousing emotions in us and giving us objects upon which to vent them, the artist purges us of emotional disturbances that might otherwise erupt inconveniently in ordinary life. The concept of catharsis can be found in both Plato and Aristotle, but it is with Aristotle that it is especially associated in the poetics and imperfect text of some lectures on tragedy and epic poetry. Aristotle advances the view that their value derives, at least in part, from their ability to focus the audience's feeling of fear and pity in a way that relieves them of these feelings. Furthermore, it does so harmlessly, in the sense that the feelings are purged without the necessity of the negative actions that normally accompany them. It should be observed straight away that Aristotle cannot be said to have a general theory along these lines. First, the Poetics is not a work about art, but only two forms of it: tragedy and epic poetry. Although Greek tragedy included music. Second, it is incomplete. We know about, but do not possess, a second volume on comedy. And perhaps Aristotle had something quite different to say about it. Third, the word catharsis only appears twice. Of course, there is nothing to stop us generalizing where Aristotle did not, and expanding upon his suggestive remarks. The key element to generalize is the idea that the value of art lies in the contribution it makes to our mental or psychological well-being. Art enables us to rid ourselves of emotions that would otherwise be disruptive or destructive by providing us with imaginary rather than real objects to vent those emotions on. The considerable appeal of this idea, especially in the 20th century, has relied heavily on what is in fact a very questionable conception of the emotional life of human beings. This is sometimes called dismissively the pressure cooker theory of emotions. And as critics point out that emotions are not a set of forces confined within the human heart. Such an idea predates modern psychology and continues to trade on the ancient doctrine of humors. According to this doctrine, love is to be found in the heart. Anger is the blood boiling, literally, and hatred is produced by bile in the spleen. We continue to use these metaphors, but have long ago abandoned the theory that underlies them. Why then would we try to continue with Aristotle's conception of catharsis, which was framed in a world where something like the doctrine of humors was thought to be true? But let us ignore these important reservations and suppose that there is some more sophisticated version of the idea that art can relieve us of emotions that would otherwise spill over into ordinary life. Even if there is some truth in this, it cannot unequivocally explain the value of art. since it works two ways. If art can purge us of harmful emotions, it can purge us of beneficial ones too. Well, thanks to art, we don't hate or hurt as many people as we might. But we don't help as many either. Once relieved of my pity by actors in the theater, I am less likely to pity the people in the Oxfam posters I pass on my way home. The next effect of catharsis, in short, is neutral as far as the purging of emotion goes. An alternative to catharsis is arousal, though the two are often combined and even confused. On this view, art is to be valued not only for relieving us of emotion, but for stimulating emotional experiences within us. In the previous section, of course, we encountered some serious objections to making emotional response on the part of an audience a key feature of art. Even if such objections could be overcome, there is reason to wonder why. Taken in isolation, there is something to be valued in the arousal of emotion. If by the skillful use of language, someone proves highly effective in arousing race hatred in her audience, this does not seem to warrant admiration of her performance or emulation of her style. Amongst the most successful uses of pictures, actions, and words for the arousal of emotion is pornography. It is plainly the purpose of pornography to arouse a specific emotion, lust, in its audience. The fact that it does so, however, does not either make it art or give us reason to value it. This is partly for the same reason as the racism example. Arousing lust in people can have negative consequences, but more important, for present purposes, is the fact that lust can be powerfully aroused by the crudest of methods. When Penguin published D.H. Lawrence's novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, a court case ensued because the prosecution alleged the novel was pornographic. The defense called witnesses to testify to its being art. What was at issue, however, was not whether the novel contained scenes likely to stimulate lustful thoughts and feelings, but whether it did so in a seriously artistic way. The crucial question about artworks is not whether they arouse emotion, but how they do this, if they do. Their value lies in the way this is done, not in the mere fact of its being done. Expression and imagination. A major part of Hosper's argument against expressivism is that it attributes states of mind to artists when it has neither evidence nor reason to do so. In this connection, he remarks that Shakespeare could hardly have gone through the experiences of Hamlet, Macbeth, Iago, Cleopatra, Lear, Goneril, Prospero, and Coriolanus in one lifetime. But what difference does this make as long as he could present us with a series of vivid, powerful, convincing characterizations? The point is that what matters is not Shakespeare's experience, but his imagination. It does not matter whether Shakespeare ever felt rage and frustration like Lear's. It only matters whether the character of Lear convincingly portrays it. Behind this thought lies the most damaging objection to expressivism. It not only ignores the value of imagination, it actually eliminates it. Tolstoy's picture, to repeat, is one in which the artist undergoes an emotional experience of some kind and uses an artistic medium to communicate this emotion. He here captures an important aspect of 19th century Romanticism, which emphasized within this picture the importance of sincerity. An artist's first duty is to be true to his or her own feelings. The mark of great art is the honesty and depth of feeling that it expresses. One consequence of this is that pretended feeling is to be deplored. From such a point of view, it is shocking to discover that John Donne composed his immensely powerful poem of grief, The First Anniversary, 1611, on the occasion of the untimely death of Mistress Elizabeth Drury, as a means of currying favor with her influential family. The sentiments he expresses in it, he could not possibly have felt, since he never knew her. Now, the implications of this example point in two directions. Romanticism, plainly, the historical fact, must diminish the poem. Donne was insincere. On the other hand, it was equally reasonable to applaud Donne for being able to give such powerful expression to grief when he himself had not felt anything like it. Very few of us can give convincing expression to things we have never felt. The great thing about artists, it might be said, is that the fertility of their imaginations enables them to overcome this limitation. Now, as the example of Donne illustrates, it is a strange consequence of expressivism that it denies aesthetic value to imagination. If expressivism is true, then an artist is really a psychological reporter, simply recording and relaying fact about internal feeling. But if this truly were the case, the artist's activity would have nothing creative about it. It is in the absence of feeling that imagination is called for. And imagination is the mark of artistic creativity. The trouble is that expressivism cannot accommodate this kind of creativity. Croce and intuition. The account of art and emotion that Tolstoy appears to subscribe to, and which I have called everyday because it is so widely believed, has been shown to be defective on several counts. However, the idea that there is some special connection between art and emotion can be founded on a philosophically more sophisticated analysis. One such analysis is to be found in the work of the highly influential 20th century theorist of art, the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce. The clearest statement of Croce's view appears in an essay entitled, "What is Art?" Its title is undoubtedly a self-conscious reference to Tolstoy's book of the same name, and some commentators have held that by choosing the same title, Croce wanted to indicate just how different his view was from that of Tolstoy. But it is not altogether easy to see just where the difference might lie. According to Croce, in words that have become the defining slogan for his theory of art, art is essentially intuition, and what lends coherence and unity to intuition is intense feeling. Intuition is truly such because it expresses an intense feeling and can arise only when the latter is its source and base. Not idea, but intense feeling is what confers upon art the ethereal lightness of the symbol. This is expressed in more philosophical language than the passage from Tolstoy quoted above, but it says something very similar. The most striking difference is the absence of any reference to art's effect upon the audience, a feature of expressivism to which we will return. When Croce says art is intuition, what does he mean and why does he say it? In answering these questions, it is best not to start with the first. The term intuition has not caught on widely in art theory, and its everyday meaning is unhelpful. But it is sufficient if we take it, for the moment, to be simply a marker for whatever it is that is special and distinctive about art. Croce, along with many other theorists, is primarily interested in pinning down the distinctively aesthetic. Accordingly, his method is what theologians in another context call the via negativa, the method of determining the nature of something by making clear what it is not. Croce's first distinction is between art and physical fact. This may seem an odd contrast to draw. but it reflects the inherently plausible claim that art cannot be identified with physical embodiment. There is more to a painting than pigments on canvas, and it is in this more that the real painting lies. Second, Crouch denies that art has anything utilitarian about it. Again, this captures a common thought. A painting might prove useful as an investment, perhaps, but this usefulness would be quite tangential to its aesthetic value. And someone who regarded it solely as an investment would have no interest in it as art. Most people accept this distinction. But Crouch adds the further contention that being productive of pleasure is also.
Hey, look. You up, madam?
Most people accept this distinction, but Crouch adds the further contention that being productive of pleasure is also a utilitarian end. And hence to be discounted. Here, more people would be inclined to disagree, since they see art as intrinsically connected with pleasure. Crouch, however, points out that if we also agree, as the arguments of chapter 1 showed, that the fact that a thing gives pleasure is insufficient to make it art, we must invoke a distinguishing and distinctive aesthetic pleasure, and hence still require an explanation of what marks off the aesthetic, the topic we examined in length in chapter 2. The next thing that art is not is a moral act. Art, says Crouch, does not originate from an act of will. This is because while it makes sense to say that an artistic image or portrayal can be of something morally praiseworthy or blameworthy, it makes no sense to say that the image is itself either of these things. To try to do so would be just as valid as to judge a square moral or a triangle immoral. Finally, and most importantly, Crouch wishes to deny that art has the character of conceptual knowledge. It is here that the meaning of the term intuition becomes somewhat clearer. Conceptual knowledge, and under this label we may include philosophy, history, and science, is founded upon a distinction between reality and unreality, so that it must compare its hypothesis with the world out there. In contrast, Intuition refers precisely to the lack of distinction between reality and unreality, to the image itself, with its purely ideal status as a mere image. The idea is, and once again this has a natural plausibility, that a work of art, unlike a scientific theory, say, is sufficient unto itself. To understand its meaning and value, we need only look at the work itself and can ignore the world beyond the work, whether it represents that world in a lifelike way, a la Courbet and the realists, or grossly distorts it, like Dali and the surrealists, is irrelevant to its aesthetic worth, which is apprehended without mediation. Hence, the language of intuition. Art is non-logical. So much for the via negativa. Art is not physical, utilitarian, moral, or productive of knowledge. What then does this leave? One approach to this question asks about the value of art. If artistic images are not constrained by external reality, practical value, or a moral purpose, what makes them more than idle fancies? Or as Croce puts it, what function belongs properly to the pure image in the life of the spirit? The answer, stated briefly, is that properly, artistic images are symbols. Art is symbol, all symbol, that is all significant. But what a symbol of what? Signifying what? Intuition is truly artistic, is truly intuition and not a chaotic accumulation of images, only when it has a vital principle which animates it and makes for its complete unity. And so we arrive at the doctrine quoted at the start. Intense feeling is what confers upon art the ethereal lightness of the symbol. In short, the images of art proper are symbolic expressions of feeling. How good are these arguments of Croce's? The considerable support his view has attracted derives, I think, from the plausibility of two elements in his via negativa: that art is essentially non-physical and non-utilitarian. That is to say, it seems evidently wrong to identify a picture, say, with the physical constituents used to embody it, or to locate its significance and value in its usefulness. On their own, of course, these insights do not constitute a conclusive proof of the expressivist contention that art is essentially linked to feeling. Moreover, it is not hard to show that at least the theory Croce advances is no less vulnerable to the objections Hospers brings against expressivism than is Tolstoy's simple assertion. What Croce's account of the matter does show, however, is that expressivism does not have to rest on either bald assertion or gut feeling. There is a philosophical case to be made for it. So instead of rehearsing the Hospers type objections already considered, then we should look instead for a version of expressivism that draws on the sophistication of Croce, while at the same time avoiding the more obvious objections. We find just such a version in R.G. Collingwood's The Principles of Art.